section of our tutorial here, we're going to be talking about PC component terminology. So before we can build anything, we need to know what we're building with. We'll take a very quick overview into the components and what each one does. Our first system is going to comprise of the following: a computer case, a motherboard, some memory, a computer processor, a processor cooling fan and heatsink, a permanent storage device, an optical device, and of course an operating system. So let's start with a computer case. A PC computer case is what holds all of your components together. They come in a large variety of sizes, colors, and shapes. However, the important thing to look for is compatibility with the hardware you're installing. As an example, if we wanted to use a full-size motherboard, which uses the ATX standard, ATX stands for Advanced Technology Extended, developed by Intel, then we need to find a case that meets that requirement. There are lots of different sizes and form factors of motherboards: mini ITX, micro ATX, thin mini ITX, to name a few. So it's very important to look at the case specs to be sure it will fit. Since we're on the subject of motherboards, let's talk about those next. Motherboards are the most complex component of your computer. Everything inside and even outside of your computer will connect to the motherboard in some way. Motherboards are largely divided into two camps: motherboards that take processors manufactured by Intel, and motherboards that take processors manufactured by AMD. AMD is generally the cheaper of the two manufacturers for processors. When we take a closer look at the components we'll use to build our computer, I'll take some extra time to go over the motherboard example we're using in our first build. There's lots of components on the motherboard, and I feel it's important for my students to have a pretty good understanding of what goes on a motherboard and what each part of it does. Let's move on to processors. A processor, or CPU, which stands for Central Processing Unit, or APU, which stands for Advanced or Accelerated Processing Unit, is the central location where all data and commands are processed. Every bit of information runs through your processor when your computer does various tasks, and it does all of that very, very fast. There are a ton of different processors, and it can get a bit dizzying figuring out which one to buy, but this course is designed to ease that pain, and I'll show you later how we'll do that. Installation of a processor into motherboard is probably the trickiest part of putting together a computer, apart from installing a water cooling system, and we'll be sure to go through that part thoroughly. So on to processor cooling. There are two primary ways to cool a processor. Both involve attaching something to the motherboard that holds the cooling unit to the processor, and both involve using thermal grease between the cooling unit and the CPU to be sure the heat is transferred completely. In our first build, we're going to use a stock fan that comes with the processor, but enhanced cooling fans in the heat sinks, as well as water cooling that includes a pump, a water block, and a radiator, are other possibilities to keep your processor workhorse cool. Next up is memory. Memory, or RAM, which stands for Random Access Memory, is the component that holds information temporarily. It's a place to put things that need to be accessed quickly. For instance, the video viewer you're using right now to view this lecture is loaded into RAM so it can be used. When you open up an internet browser on your computer, it loads the program from your hard disk, which is an example of permanent storage, and into RAM to be used. Desktop RAM is installed as sticks of various speeds and form factors. We'll look at the differences a bit later, but for now, let's move on to permanent storage. Permanent storage is a general term for where your data is stored when your computer is turned off. They can be things like hard disks, solid-state disks or SSDs, CDs, DVDs, and other optical media. Hard disks use a magnetic platter to store data, and the platter spins while a magnetic head reads and writes data to the disk. SSDs are very much like RAM, but a little bit slower and can permanently store data when the system is off. CDs and DVDs have their data burned to the media physically. When we build our first computer, I'm going to recommend an SSD as your permanent storage solution because of the incredibly enhanced performance over classic spindle hard disks. We'll also add a rewritable optical drive to make installation of our operating system easier. So we can't really do anything with the computer if we don't have a way to power all the components. So let's take a look at power supplies. The most important thing to think about with power supplies is the wattage and the connectors it uses. When buying a new computer that's been assembled for you by a manufacturer like HP or Dell, the wattage requirement has already been thought out. If we're building our own system, we need to think about this number. Generally, a desktop will come with a video card, and that video card is going to have the highest pull of power out of all other components. You can generally go by the suggested system power requirement from the manufacturer of the card as your guide. I like to add another 100 watts to that number in case I want to upgrade and to give the power supply some breathing room. In our case, though, our first computer is going to include an APU processor, which actually includes the video processing right on the chip. So we don't have the video card as a guide in this case. So what we'll do is we'll end up looking at the power requirements of each component and adding them up to decide on a power supply. Regarding the connectors on a power supply, it's important to know what power connectors your system will require before purchasing that power supply. Our system is pretty lean on connector requirements, so we'll have a pretty easy time finding a power supply to suit our needs. In the power supply world, there's a type of power supply called a modular power supply. I highly recommend these as they lessen the number of cables that you have to manage inside the computer case. Modular means the cables can be disconnected from the power supply and stored away for later when you want to upgrade your system with more components or even different components. So we've got all the hardware components of the computer and it powers up, but we can't interact with it. So how do we make use of these components? That's where software comes in, and the main software in a computer to make it usable is called the operating system. There are lots of operating systems and versions available from Windows to Mac OS to Linux, but for our build we're going to be using Windows 7. Windows 8 is available, but as an IT professional, I feel 7 is still the better operating system and has a better interface to understand. At this time, Windows 10 is on its way and it's looking pretty good, so if it's out by the time you take this lecture, I recommend going that route. So, we've taken a look at all the components we need to build our basic system. Next, we'll take a look at how to look for parts online in a smart way that gets you the most bang for your buck. Video, we're going to be looking at some online resources and how to shop smart for computer components. So it's really easy to get lost when trying to find parts to build a PC online if you haven't been doing it for a long time. This will be a guide that you will quickly be able to use to have more confidence in what you're buying online. So the first website, you probably have heard of it because it's the most commonly used website for purchasing computer hardware online, and it's called Newegg.com. I've been a customer for Newegg for 15 to 20 years. I've lost count at this point. Their customer support is absolutely amazing. And usually when you're price shopping, Newegg ends up being the lowest price for things anyway. So I generally like to start at Newegg.com to sort of build out my system if I know exactly what I want. It's still smart to price shop on other sites, and I'll show you how to do that easily in a little bit, but let's first take a quick peek at Newegg.com. And I've made my windows here really large print, so hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm doing here without too much squinting. Okay, so this is Newegg.com. I subscribe to their email newsletter where they offer deals, mainly because the deals are usually pretty good. Usually I hate those kinds of things coming into my email, but because I'm a technician and I do this kind of stuff for a living, it's good to see those deals come into your mailbox if you're looking for something in particular, because they're usually pretty substantial. So let's take a look at that first. You can actually get to that email newsletter directly on their site in this email deals button at the top. And this is usually what gets sent to your email if you do subscribe. So here's a pretty good example, right? $30 for a Corsair power supply, which is really, really good. 500 watts. That's beautiful. And like I said, they offer a ton of different products when they have these sales. Cases, monitors, memory, hard drives, CPUs, routers. The list goes on and on. So if you're looking for something in particular, I would recommend just holding off for a few days to first check and see if there's a deal already. But more likely than not, you're going to see something similar that you'll want, that you can pull directly from this and save yourself some money. Okay, so that's our first sort of demo here, is checking out the email deals. So when I'm shopping for hardware, I tend to go by number of reviews and how many stars, or in this case eggs, that they get, and I analyze the comments pretty closely. So let's take an example here. Let's say we want to buy a hard drive, okay, and there are a gazillion hard drives in these lists. But let's just say you're looking for a desktop hard drive in, let's say, the 500 gigabyte to terabyte range. So you could simply just drill in and choose your capacity here, but then you'll see that there's still, even though you've chosen hard drives between 500 gigabyte and a terabyte, you still have 517 products to go through. To sort of make that easier, and again, I'll show, there's another site we're going to look at in a little bit that will make this even easier than what I'm showing you here. But I generally like to go by best rating, right? And then you can see what the best of the best is, right, based on the reviews. You could drill in there and look at those reviews and make sure that you agree with what they're saying, make sure there's no red flags of an issue with this particular drive. And then if that's if that's too much, you can continue scrolling, and it's still sorted by reviews here. So we got 5 egg reviews, so it's going to do all the 5 egg reviews first, from most number of reviews to lowest number of reviews for 5 eggs. See, 5 eggs, 1 review, 5 eggs, 1 review. Now let's get to 4 eggs. 4 eggs I still consider to be pretty good. A lot of it comes down to people having configuration issues or compatibility issues, and that's why they're not giving it 5 stars. And the best way to make sure that doesn't happen to you is to go in and check on those reviews and see why people are leaving bad reviews. And a lot of times it has nothing to do with the quality of the product. It has to do with a return process. It has to do with a compatibility issue with their system. Who knows? 4 and 5 stars are great. I've never had a problem with either of those counts on Newegg. So, as an example, let's go to the top one here, which is a Western Digital, and we're actually going to look at the reviews for a little bit. And I'm wondering, I've never done this before, but I think we can actually look at the 1 star. Yeah, let's look at some 1 stars. So this guy says all 3 of them were DOAs for the ones that he bought. I really don't believe this at all. It's very rare you'll get a DOA drive, and to get 3 in a row like that sounds to me like a configuration issue. If you look at the pros and the cons and you read the cons and it sounds completely out of the ordinary or it sounds too far-fetched, it probably is. So again, I generally look through low-end reviews just to see if there's something glaring. So for instance, if a whole bunch of them are all saying the same thing about the product that makes it not a 5-egg product, then it's probably got an issue and you should move on. Okay. So that's a quick peek at reviews. And that's, it's a huge site. You can certainly search for something that you want, and it'll come up with a gazillion different products. But Newegg is in my opinion built for building a system from scratch, and it's geared towards those kinds of people. So you can certainly buy a laptop on here if you're looking for that. Their prices are pretty good. But again, this company has really, they're like the pinnacle definition of how to build a system from scratch and offering you all the resources to do that without a big problem. Okay, so we'll get back to Newegg later when we build our system. But let's head on over to another site called Pcpartpicker.com. This site is just absolutely amazing. It's your best tool to help you recognize incompatibilities with your system. It'll search for parts across different websites to give you the cheapest cost for a particular part. And like I said, you'll find that Newegg will actually have those cheapest parts, but sometimes you'll find that another website will have the part you're looking for at, maybe they're running a sale or a mail-in rebate that Newegg isn't doing. So that'll bring up those for you so you don't miss out on those deals. So let's hop on over to Pcpartpicker right now. And where you're going to start, and really the most useful part of this site, in my opinion, is the compatibility checker, right? So the system build, I've already got one started here. So let's remove all these and start over. So these are the different components of a system. We're going to build a system using this feature on their site, so you can see how to build a system and watch out for compatibility problems. So as an example, let's go ahead and choose a motherboard. And I'm going to choose a motherboard that's an AMD motherboard. And I already know what the socket and CPU types are. So I know the FM1 and AM3, those are AMD socket types. So let's just say I choose this one. And we say, I might have to go back. Yeah, let's go back. So I don't know which one that was. So I think I chose one of the AM3. So let's just choose an AM3 socket type. And then we're going to add. This is confusing with the small text, or big text rather. So we're going to click add over here. This adds it to your config, your system build. So now, you see, look at that, the lowest price is Newegg. So now that we've chosen this, if we go and look at the CPU or the processor, you'll notice that all of them are AMD. So it helps, especially newcomers to building new systems like this from scratch. It's a really good tool to not screw yourself over when buying all these parts and not realizing one is not compatible, right? So here we go. Now we have an AMD processor with an AMD motherboard, and if you choose a case, a box for this, this will give you the correct size case. So there are different size motherboards. There's really tiny motherboards, there's really big motherboards. And if you choose a really tiny case for a large motherboard, this site will not let you do that. Okay, and you can absolutely turn off the filter. So if you really want to see all of the items anyway, you can go ahead and click turn off, and you can peruse all of the items as much as you want. Okay, so we've gone through how to prevent yourself from having an issue with compatibility. This site's really good for that. They do have benchmarks here, and we're actually going to look at another site for benchmarks because I don't really think this site does enough of it. They do have benchmarks, but I'll show you another site that actually has a lot more benchmarks and actually has a lot more samples too. Samples meaning a lot more systems are collecting the data. I don't believe that this site has a lot of collection of data, so these may or may not be inaccurate. And plus, there's not enough, in my opinion. There's not enough choice. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next site up on the list. It's actually two sites, and they're both run by a company called Passmark Software. There's Cpubenchmark.net and VideoCardBenchmark.net. And it's an incredibly useful site when trying to decide on a CPU or video card, because these sites take, like I said, they take benchmark data from thousands of systems across the globe. Folks that use the benchmarking software, they have the option of submitting their benchmarks to Passmark, and then these sites aggregate the data for you. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first one we're going to use here. That's Cpubenchmark.net. And I will say straight away that there are quite a few different charts here, but to keep your system competitive and to to not have your system considered to be old too quickly, I'd always use the high-end CPU chart. I'm sure the CPUs and the other charts would work fine for your system, but honestly, a lot of them in those are hard to find. Some of them aren't sold anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So to put yourself at ease and to give yourself an easier time, the high-end CPU chart is probably where you want to be. So let's take a look at that real quick here. So as I said, these are benchmarks taken from thousands of machines. Okay, and these numbers are pretty arbitrary when we're looking at it, and all it really is they are numbers that the software sort of spits out as a score. So you're only looking at the scores and you're comparing one score to another. That doesn't really tell you much, right? But because this is the high-end CPU chart, you can guess pretty well that these CPUs will work for whatever you're doing. Unless you're doing some really, really high-end complex, mathematics tasks or research or anything like that, maybe you'd be looking at these ones up here that cost thousands of dollars. But generally, you should not have to spend more than $100 for a CPU for a very broad usage computer. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is a way to spend as little money as you need to get the most out of the processor that you can. Okay, and there's a little link up here called price performance. So you'll see, and this is a pretty good example of way too much money for what you get. This top processor is almost $7,000, but this is the performance price, dollar per performance ratio here, and it's horrible. It's just way too much money for what you get. So as we scroll down here, you'll notice some of these are, they're getting up there. They're getting pretty good for what you're paying. The lower the cost, the higher they are on the chart. It's pretty good. And here's an AMD one. As I said before, AMD chips are cheaper than Intel for the most part. And I will say that AMD isn't doing that great company-wise. But they're still around. Their chips are still absolutely feasible, as you can see in here. But the last system I built was an AMD, and it's run beautifully for me. It's a little cube gaming computer. So for a budget computer, AMD is my recommendation, and you'll notice that AMD is always the one that gives you the most value, right? So you'll notice that we're getting down in price: 200, 180, 160, 145. If you're looking to say do some gaming on the computer, I wouldn't go too far down this chart. So this one might be a decent deal. You'll pay a little bit more, but we'll talk about what components in your computer should have a higher price tag on them because you need them to perform better for what you're doing. So as an example, this chip would be pretty good for the performance for a gaming computer. Okay, but the first machine we're building is not so much a gaming machine, but more of a general usage machine. So here's an AMD FX. Here's another FX. Now we've gotten below the $100 mark. So right around here is where I would recommend sort of looking. Here's another under $100 CPU. And you can keep going down farther and farther. But like I said, if you don't go too far, don't go to the next charts. It's a little bit too cheap, and the hardware may not be up to spec in the next 2 years or so. Okay, so it's good to stay on this chart. Depending on what you're doing with the system, go farther down, go farther up. If you need a little bit more performance, go up here to where it's almost 200. But in all honesty, I've seen people build these ridiculous, high performance systems. They'll spend $1,000 on a CPU, and they're really just screwing themselves over as far as performance. They're just using the buzzwords of i7 and whatever the latest is, but it's just too much money. It doesn't make any sense. All right, so that's our overview of the Cpubenchmark site. There's also a video card benchmark site. Oops, let's try that again. Video card. Okay. And this is the same company, Passmark Software, same kind of deal. In our case, the first system we're building is not going to have a video card. It's built into the processor. So we're not going to really need to do this. But, if I do end up creating more higher end systems, I would want to come here and again look at the price per performance. And again, there are some crazy price tags here, right? GTX Titan Black, right? $1,280. And I'll tell you, they can make it that price purely because of the Titan name. It sounds big, it sounds awesome, but it's all marketing. You're not making a sound financial decision here. So gaming systems and gaming video cards, again, I really don't feel that you need to spend more than $150 or $200 for a really, really awesome video card. And here's a couple examples, right? Radeon. All of the Radeons tend to be lower price for the performance, which I think is great. Radeon cards are great. The drivers for the video cards tend to be a little subpar to NVIDIA, which is what these GeForce ones are. That's my only gripe, but I've had success with both brands. All right, so I think I might be running long with this video. I hope what I've showed is useful to you, and we'll go ahead and move on to our next section of our series here. Thanks for watching. In this lecture, we'll be talking about choosing components based on requirements. With all the different brands and models of computer parts available in the wild, it can be a daunting task figuring out which ones to get. It's even more daunting if you have a specific task for your computer in mind, but don't know which components should perform the best for those tasks. In this lecture, we're going to tackle those problems to make it easier to decide which parts to buy. Let's start by defining some tasks and figuring out which components should have higher performance than the others so that the task in question can be completed without any headaches. So our first system will be used for lots of things, general usage and internet browsing. This is the most common system for obvious reasons, and it'll be our first system build. You have a lot of wiggle room in component choice for a general usage system. However, to make the computer enjoyable to use and to accomplish general tasks in a short amount of time, I would recommend not buying the cheapest of the cheap to get the best deal. If task productivity is important to you, then this factor is especially important. We also want your computer to be viable for more than just a couple of years. A general usage system's components should be middle ground across the board. My discussion earlier about shopping for a CPU uses that thought process, and we'll talk a bit more about this when we choose our components for our first system later on. Next up is gaming. This is an easy one. Gaming and 3D games require higher-end video cards to process and display the 3D worlds, and to allow for an enjoyable experience in the game with high refresh rates on the screen. Nobody likes playing a beautiful 3D game that jumps and lags because the system is struggling to keep up. Gaming doesn't necessarily need a top-of-the-line processor. Some people may disagree with me, however, the majority of the work for your games are done by the video card, not the CPU. In fact, some games allow you to move even more processing functions over to the graphics card for even better performance. Memory is important due to the size of game files, especially imagery. At this time, I recommend a general system to have 8 gigs of RAM for a nice experience, but I would double this for gaming at 16 gigabytes. Hard disk speed and access time is important if you don't like loading times, but if you don't mind waiting longer between levels where the game may load data, you can skimp on this and get a spindle hard disk. However, I do still recommend an SSD for all systems. The issue with that recommendation, though, is that SSDs are more expensive than spindle hard drives, and game data is usually quite large and may fill up the drive quickly. A solution to this is to use the smaller SSD purely for your operating system files and buy a secondary large spindle drive, which is much cheaper, for your personal files and for game installations. That way, the system will be able to run the OS quickly and won't make the game suffer any performance when doing so. Next, let's look at a system built for programming. Programming in itself does not require a lot of processing power. When I say programming, I mean typing in the text of your program. However, when compiling your program, the system has to access hundreds and perhaps even thousands of small files to build your program. Because of that fact, you will need a strong CPU and a fast hard disk. Programmers will also tend to use virtual machines to test their programs, so lots of memory is a requirement as well. Let's talk about those VMs next. A VM is a virtual machine by definition. It's a system within a system. In other words, you could be running Windows, but have another operating system like Linux running in its own sandbox, or its own window. VMs require a ton of resources. Whenever a VM is run, it splits the resources of your computer amongst the VMs that are running. Because of this, VM host systems need lots and lots of CPU processing power, memory, and hard disk speed. What you can skimp on in this case of VMs is video card performance. For the most part, VMs aren't used for gaming or other video type tasks. Now let's take a look at video processing or creation. If the system is planned to be used mostly for video creation and editing, you'll need lots and lots of hard disk space. That's the most important part in the case of video editing because videos are generally large files. That said, editing can take time to process. So if you're looking for video editing to happen faster, and for exports and conversions of video to happen faster as well, a good CPU is also recommended. In my opinion, the rest of the components don't matter too much. In this case, you can stick with mid-grade components for the rest. Let's take a look at home theater systems. Building your own home theater system is currently one of the more common reasons why someone would want to build their own PC. In the case of home theaters, a new paradigm comes into play for some people, and that's the case itself of the computer. Generally, you want your living room devices to all kind of look the same and be the same size. So there is a sort of home theater sized case that you could use for this type of system for it to not look like an eyesore in your living room. Other than that, hard disks I think are the most important component for this. A home theater is a system that will hold all your videos and movies. Obviously, those are quite large. So having large hard disks is pretty much required. In this case, I do not think SSDs are necessary, however. Videos don't need high transfer rates to get from the disk to the screen without a delay, so normal spin drives are just fine. Depending on the resolution you'd like to see on your TV when connected to the home theater PC, you may or may not need a good video card. Enthusiasts may try and max out their video card budget, but I don't think that's necessary. Since we're not processing 3D, a standard video processor, which can be on board or in an APU, should be sufficient for your television. A more important discussion is what connections the TV has as compared to your video card. VGA, DVI, HDMI, DisplayPort. Be sure your home theater PC can push the maximum resolution that your TV supports. Bitcoin generation. This is a rather advanced example, but I thought it was good to include because of its unique hardware requirement. In short, Bitcoins are a virtual currency generated by having computers solve complex mathematical problems. I won't go into details about it too much, but the basic gist is Bitcoins require ridiculously fast processors to figure out these problems. GPUs, or graphics processing units, are actually the best at accomplishing this particular task. So in a Bitcoin system, you could easily skimp on all other devices and have a ridiculously fast graphics card. In fact, there are graphics cards specifically designed to process Bitcoin math. Alright, so we've looked at a few different tasks that would require different performance ratings for the different components in a system. I think this is an important subject because I feel that lots of folks who buy a computer don't necessarily understand how each component can affect the productivity of whatever they want to do with the computer. This gives a glimpse into that information and at the very least will give you a good guide when shopping for a pre-built computer as well as the parts for building your own computer. So we're going to take a shot at choosing some components for our first computer. However, I'd like to take a quick moment and talk about pricing and the whole get what you pay for paradigm. We could certainly build an entire system using the cheapest components possible, but do we really want to? Do we want a cheap system that could potentially not work when we put it together, or should we spend a little bit of money and build a system that'll last a few years? If we're putting a computer together ourselves, we're probably going to have a bit of time, effort, and love invested into it, so why not make it something nice? Perhaps even nice enough to show off to our friends. Let's actually take a look at building a super cheap computer using Newegg.com and see where we're at. We'll go through the components after we build one and decide if we have a decent computer or just a computer on the cheap that may or may not work. I've put together a shopping cart on Newegg.com full of components that are at the bottom of the totem pole in price. We'll go through these components now so I can show you some reasons why it's a good idea to lift the bar a bit even when purchasing parts on a budget. So here we are on Newegg. This is a list of components I've compiled into a shopping cart, and we're going to go through them one by one so we can find the reasons why we may not want to purchase these. We'll start with the case here. This is a refurbished Diablotech case. It's regularly $50, and we have a $25 discount, bring it down to $25. That sounds great, especially because it comes with a power supply. But let's take a deeper look at this case. So the first thing I can see that is an issue here is it's refurbished. When you buy a refurbished case, what ends up happening usually is the power supply that's included with the case has a ton of dust, or it's dirty on the inside of the case because it's been used. So let's take a look at the case itself. And I will say that my main reason for not buying this case is that the inside, the metal, is not painted. One of the reasons why that's an issue is because, especially with a really cheap case, is that the metal can be very sharp, can be very thin and flimsy. It could cut you, it could cut the cables. It's just not a really sturdy encasing that can be used for all the components that you're going to be putting into it. So that's one reason why you wouldn't choose this case. Another reason is the fact that it comes with a 400 watt power supply. Getting a case for $25 with a 400 watt power supply, you have to think to yourself, well, they're factoring in the cost of the power supply into this price. So you're basically buying a $10 or $15 power supply. That is just, you're going to get what you pay for, which is going to be a garbage power supply. And you want your power supply to be pretty decent. You want your computer components to have a nice flow of power coming to them without any issues, without any fluctuations in the voltage, etc., etc. So that's another reason why I wouldn't go with this case. Another reason is I don't believe this case has USB 3 ports on it. So if you have a motherboard that you wanted to have the USB 3 ports come out the front, this case would not do it for you. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the reviews as well. Hey, look at that. This baby sliced my finger. So as I was talking about before, the metal is very thin, so we really don't want that to happen to you. Okay, let's see. Oh, look, dust in the fan for the power supply. Interesting. So I think we could stop there regarding this case. This is not a case that we would buy for a number of reasons. Let's move on to our next component, and that is our motherboard. Cheap motherboard. Regularly $35, save $5, now it's $30. Okay, so number one right off the bat that I don't like about this motherboard is the memory speed. For this day and age, DDR3 1600 is pretty slow. Let's see what's on the board here. Okay, so we have USB 3 ports, that's good. However, I do not see a USB 3 header, which is where you would plug the case USB 3 ports into. So if you had a case that had a USB 3 ports on it, you would not be able to use them. So that's an issue. Another issue I see here is we only have 2 SATA controller ports. So you could only have 2 devices maximum for drives in your machine. That's a no-brainer. I would probably skip this board because of that. Let's see what else we have here. Let's take a look at some of the reviews. See some issues people are having. Can't overclock. No SPDIF output, which is digital audio. Only 2 SATA ports. Looks like there's some issue with memory. You can only have a certain kind, even though the website says the opposite. Alright, so I think that's enough for now for this motherboard. I don't think we're going to go with this motherboard. And I've shown you some reasons why. All right, so that's motherboard. Let's take a look at the next one, which is the processor. This is the type of processor that would go with that motherboard. It's an AM1 slot form factor that we would use. There's not much to say about a processor. What I can do is show you where this falls on the CPU benchmark that we talked about before. So let's go over here. I actually have it open already. So this is the high mid-range CPUs chart. This is not the chart that I have recommended to use. The high-end chart, which is the one I recommend to use, has a lot of processors on it. So even if you hit way down below down here, these are some fairly low performing CPUs. But this particular CPU we're looking at falls on the second page, which I don't really like. And if we were to take a look at some of the reviews are going to say things like, let's see, here we go, can't play 1080p video smoothly. That's a no-brainer. You know, YouTube is where you would see something like that, and it would be upsetting to have the option to play 1080p and then the frame rates crap out and everything looks horrible. Okay, so I think that's enough for this CPU. Let's move on. Memory. Not much to say about this, except that it only has 4 reviews. You know, there are some well-known brands that I like to go with. I don't really know this Team Elite brand. I like Crucial. I like Kingston. Again, it's fairly cheap. This is the cheapest of this type that I could find, but I don't like the number of reviews, to be honest. And the timing here, this isn't great for high performance systems, and you'll probably see some complaints about that in here. Yeah, complaints about the timings. This memory would probably work great, but I would skip it based on the timings and the fact that it's such a low, well, that's really based on the motherboard, the low speed and the timings. Okay, so let's kill that. And yes, hard drives. Oh boy. So number one, this is refurbished, which only gives you a 90-day warranty. That's real bad. It's a really cheap drive, $16, and you got yourself 160 gigs of storage. But your drive is your data. That's where it's the most important part of your system when it comes to your files. And you want it to be a really solid piece of hardware that you have some faith in, where you're not thinking, is this drive going to crap out again because it's refurbished. But beyond that, I don't like the 2 megabytes cache. Nowadays, you see 8 meg, 16, even 64 for spindle drives. 160 gig is really small. You could get an SSD drive of the same size. It'll probably be about $150, 100 to $150 for that size. Actually, it might even be less than that now. But you'll have a solid, high-performing device where you can store your data, rather than this this guy, which you just don't know if it's going to survive. Okay, so that's the hard drive, and here's the mouse and keyboard. Now you'll notice that this is actually a pretty decent deal. $15, 5 eggs, 270 reviews. I'm actually going to use this in our first build. So, lowest cost isn't necessarily a bad thing if you look at everything else. And I consider keyboards and mice to be sort of throwaway devices. They always get all dirty and mucked up, and a lot of times they get so filled with stuff you just have to replace them. So I like to keep the price on these low anyway. Okay, so let's see. The last thing here is a DVD burner. A lot of people who build systems don't even put burners in their systems anymore for a number of reasons. There's everything is digital and downloaded nowadays. We have the USB thumb drives, and for people that do install these into their systems, it's really just for emergencies, or if they have data stored on DVDs or CDs that they just don't feel like converting, they would install one of these. This is a refurbished drive. I do like the Asus brand, but it is refurbished, does not have any reviews. That's a problem. Like I said, it's one of those things where this drive is probably just going to be used for pulling in data that you might have on CDs or DVDs. I don't know. It's really up to you. I will say that really cheap low-end burners tend to crap out sooner than others. I don't really know why. It's happened to me many, many times. So if you're looking for your drive to be used fairly often, I would try and raise the bar a little bit and get something nice. Okay, so that's it. That's our list of components. I hope that how I sort of discussed things and how I, my thought process for purchasing components was helpful. And I want to thank you for watching this video as well as the rest of the video in the series. And we will move on. In this video in our series, we're going to be picking out some components to buy for our first build. So we're going to be looking at some hardware that I've picked out for our first build. We'll go over each component and I'll tell you why I picked them out. Our first build is a general use system. It will utilize an APU processor, which includes a video processor on the chip. Therefore, we won't need a separate video card. We'll also be using a mid-sized ATX case, just so we have enough room to move around when putting it all together. Alright, so let's get started. We will start with the case. So this is a case from Deepcool called the Tesseract. It's a case I chose for the following reasons. Number one, the reviews were pretty decent, and the only complaints were specific to people's very specific builds. Some odd issues that really, wouldn't affect you too much. There is some complaints about the metal being flimsy, but because the metal is actually painted on the inside, I'll show some pictures here, that helps with that a lot. The flimsiness may still be there, but the sharpness of the edges is really what worries me the most with these cases. So it's a fairly cheap case. It's nice looking, and the painted interior is good. It's a decent price, and it's got a fancy window, which we like to see, so we can show off the computer that we've built. So this may not be your style, and that's important. If this isn't your style, you can certainly shop for other cases, but this is the case that we'll use for our example build. Alright, next up is a power supply. I chose this power supply based on the brand name. Corsair is good. The wattage, we don't really need a high wattage power supply for this system. You won't really find a lot of power supplies below 350 or 400. So this was actually the lowest end wattage for this model. But based on the hardware that we have in our system, we're not going to be anywhere near that because we don't have a full-fledged video card in the unit. Okay, so the reviews are really good. I also took a look at the cables. The cables are important. We have the right types of cables for what we want to do. We really don't have much going on with the system. We have power going to the drives. Obviously, we have power going to the motherboard. That's pretty much it, to be honest. And also, really, the selling factor for me on this is not only the quality, but the fact that it's modular. Let me see if I can pull up a picture of the modular side so you can see the plugs. Yeah, right there. So those plugs make it so you don't have to have all of the wires coming from the power supply in your computer. It saves space. It allows for more breathing room and airflow. So it's an all-around good plan, and you get a pretty good deal too. This is really good. $35 after a $20 rebate. That's amazing. Okay, so that's it for the power supply. All right, so let's move on to the motherboard. The motherboard I chose for the following reasons. I recognize ASUS as a great brand. I've owned lots of their hardware and know that it's built very well. The video ports, we have HDMI, DVI, and VGA, which actually allows you to have 3 displays going at once without extra hardware, which is really nice. And also, this motherboard has a PCI Express slot, just in case we want to upgrade the graphics card later down the line. Okay, so we've got our motherboard. Now let's take a look at the processor that I've chosen for this build. Okay, so the processor I chose is an A10 7850K AMD. Now, I bumped up the budget for this guy mainly because we're somewhat limited to the models of processor that we have available for socket FM2 Plus. And I used the CPU benchmark site that we've talked about already. And if we go to high-end CPU chart, go price performance, and we'll search A810. There she is, 7850K. So it's close to 40 on the scale of dollar to performance. That's pretty decent. You know, we might want something a bit higher, like this X4 860K. But you know, because we sort of chose the motherboard first, we're sort of backed into a corner to have a very limited choice. There are some other A10 processors on here. They're about the same dollar to performance ratio. Some of them, though, aren't FM2 Plus socketed. We want FM2 Plus. I mean, the motherboard will take an FM2 socketed processor, but you actually lose some features such as the PCI Express 3.0 capability of the board. So once again, we're sort of backed into our corner on this one, and we're going to go with the A10 here. So it's got some great reviews. The performance is awesome. There's a lot of CPU cores, which allows you to do multiple things at once. So we're pushing this system now a little bit above the whole general usage sort of scenario. You could probably start playing some games on here, maybe even doing some video processing. So if you want to take a quick look at the reviews, you know, they say a lot of good things about it. It's not for aggressive overclocking, which we're not going to do. You know, they do overclock in some of these systems, it looks like. But overall, it looks like people are happy with it. So we will go with this processor for this series, or this system rather. So on to the permanent storage, which is a mid-range SSD by Kingston. I chose this SSD for a number of reasons. I've mentioned before that SSDs are far faster than normal spindle hard drives, and the price per gigabyte has come down substantially. So in this particular case, we're getting 2 gigs per dollar. That's pretty awesome. I've used tons of these drives in laptop builds that I've done, and when I replace and upgrade hard drives, I use these SSDs pretty much exclusively, and they've all worked very, very well. The reviews are good. You know, there aren't many issues found. It's got 4 eggs. I'm sure some people have compatibility issues. So, you know, I looked through this and everything looked very well to me. So I chose this SSD because of that. So if I needed more space in this build that we're doing, if we wanted to, say, have a secondary spindle hard drive that's very large, say it's 2 terabytes or 3 terabytes, we could absolutely do this. But for this case, 120 gigs, a lot of things are stored online, in the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. So you can start out with this SSD at a fairly small SSD, 120 gigabytes, and you can, depending on what you're doing, a general use system, this will be plenty for a long time to come. All right, so the remaining 4 components in the system we'll go through pretty quickly. I don't really think it's super important what you choose for the rest, mainly because there's a lot to choose from. The components are cheap anyway, pretty much. So for memory, I use this G Skill that matches the speed of the motherboard. It's got great reviews. They look cool, etc., etc. Okay, and then the DVD drive, $20, 5,000 reviews at 5 eggs. That's pretty crazy. So that was a no-brainer. We talked about this Logitech keyboard and mouse in one of my previous videos. Again, 5 eggs, really cheap. I like the Logitech brand. Another no-brainer. And finally, Windows. We'll probably, you can absolutely install any kind of operating system on your machine. I know there's a lot of folks will sort of argue over, well, Windows 7 is so old. What about Windows 8? I've mentioned this before, but Windows 7 right now, at least at the time of this recording, is the primo operating system for compatibility reasons, meaning the most programs and the most software runs on Windows 7. Windows 8, I would stay away from, purely for interface reasons. And Windows 10 is actually looking pretty good, as I've mentioned before. And if you buy Windows 7, Windows 10 comes free later on, and you can certainly install it over this. But I highly recommend, especially for a first-time builder, to definitely go with Windows 7. You'll have the easiest installation experience, and you can follow along with this video, or rather this series, and it'll be a lot easier for you to get the system completed and be happy about it. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this video. These are the components that we're going to use for our build, and we will move right on.